Welcome. I am Sister Who. In thinking about the way people interact within society the other day, it seems to me that in the town in which I grew up, it was like everything ran on categories. And if you were a creative, different sort of person who didn't fit one of the categories, no one really knew what to do with you. And so they would essentially ignore your existence, kind of let you do whatever you wanted to, but it was kind of like that psychological thing of the elephant in the living room. That if you have something that doesn't fit one of the categories, you don't know how to talk about it or how to address it or what to think of it, and so you try to pretend it's not there, instead of treating it like a learning opportunity. Any place where I've been where somebody, from a foreign country, for example, walks into the room, to me it's interesting because that immediately presents an opportunity to learn something that I've never been exposed to before. Another example of the same thing might be an elderly person. I recall reading somewhere once that someone said that when an elderly person dies, it's like a library burning down. There's this wealth of experience and this wealth of perspective that this person has, and suddenly it's no longer available. But especially in my high school, there was this very specific thing of categories. The popular crowd, the ones who went for sports, the art crowd, the ones who kind of carried on the archetype of the rebel. In my school, that happened to be long hair and black leather jackets and things like that. I'm sure it's something different for every different place, but it's that crowd of students that everyone seems to look down on, not for any good reason, but they just never seem to be able to fit in. And they're kind of their own rebellious crowd, I guess, and kind of become family to each other. Well, I never really fit in any of them because on one hand I did very well in school, but I was never popular because I always had these different, more creative perspectives. And there wasn't really an art department crowd in the school that I went to. And the high school was kind of a microcosm of what was going on in the community in which I lived, because it was very much that there were expectations. There were expectations for everything. And if you didn't live up to those expectations, it was like constantly swimming upstream, constantly fighting to be yourself, constantly trying to get past all of society's blind spots. By blind spots, I mean things like, when everyone says you need to be honest. Being honest is good. Honesty is the best policy. And then as I grew up, I had to enter a world where most people weren't honest. And I had people telling me that I was too honest, that if I was completely honest, I would be actually allowing people to take advantage of me more. And suddenly, honesty wasn't so good anymore. That's one of what I call society's blind spots. Things that go on that it's like they happen, and anyone who looks at it knows there's a real inconsistency here, but somehow it never gets addressed. Kind of like, the way in some churches, to my observation, there's a tolerated hypocrisy, and someone once made the joke that it's a good thing there are churches, otherwise where would the hypocrites go? Be it as it may, it still seems to me that it's something that should be addressed. In America, it's almost universal agreement now that everyone has a dysfunctional family, but an awful lot of people aren't interested in doing anything about it. It's another blind spot, something that, well, we've all agreed it's not the way it should be, but we're busy, and we don't really have any interest in doing anything about it. And maybe we can't fix it, maybe we can't change the whole world, as they say, but maybe we can do a little, maybe we can do something, maybe we can set an example. I think because my family was so unexpressive and so reserved in so many ways. I grew up with this compulsion to do the opposite, to be expressive, to be an open, honest person. And it never ceased to amaze me how people would say the right thing to do, and I would look at it from this angle and that angle and say, well, yeah, it really does seem to be the right thing to do. And having come to that conclusion and that agreement, if I proceeded to do that, it's like the title of a book I once saw. I never got through reading the whole book, and this was years ago, but the title of the book was Christianity Rubs Holes in My Religion. And I found that if I tried to pursue that which I understood to be true Christianity, most of the time it didn't sit well with the different churches and the different church people that I came into contact with, because the way they were living their life was not consistent with their creed, with what they professed. Some of the religious jargon I encountered spoke of it as not walking your talk, not doing what you say. Yeah, and in one sense, to use the metaphor of an archery range, I had a real brief archery class in gym class in high school, and basically no one in the class had ever picked up a bow and arrow before. And so we went out to this archery range and all lined up there, and the teacher ran us through the cycle of, okay, everybody shoot, now nobody move, now everybody go get your arrows. And every single person in the class aimed for the bullseye, and nobody in the class thought they would ever hit it. Some people did. But my point is not whether or not we hit the bullseye, as that it didn't make any sense to aim for anything else. Whether I actually believed I was going to hit it or not, I needed to aim for the bullseye, and I didn't, to slip into this blind spot sort of thing of professing an ideal and not living up to it, is kind of like going out there and saying, oh, I'm not going to hit it anyway, and just shooting an arrow off, while looking the other direction. What's the point of shooting the arrow? I mean, then you have to expend the energy to go get it and bring it back again. It seems to me if you're going to pick up the bow, if you're going to pick up the arrow, you need to aim for the bullseye. I mean, that's what you want to hit at least. But we have our different categories, and a lot of times we don't really look at where they're not being consistent with each other, or the implications of our categories. In observing the way people interact with religion, it's kind of fascinating in a way, the paradoxes that go on. The embracing of a certain degree of hypocrisy. On one hand, God is supposed to be this big, incredible spiritual person that transcends all our definitions and encompasses more than we could understand. And then we turn around and come up with theology, these statements that are supposed to define God. And by the time we get done expressing all the theology, it's like we put God in a box. And we've said, well, this is what God will do in this situation. And I guess my thought is, well, if God's a living person, doesn't God have the option of doing something different for a different reason that we didn't happen to notice? I read an article once where there was a woman driving a car and her husband was in an airplane, and they were on two-way radio trying to get from one place to another. I think it was an ultralight airplane or a hang glider or something like that, so that she had to be there wherever he landed. And it was because it wasn't airport related, but it was like she didn't know her way through a town, and he was up above in his hang glider saying, okay, well, you go to this intersection, you turn right, and okay, now you're there, now turn left to the next one, and I'll be right over in that field about half a mile down, a field which she couldn't see from inside the car. At the same time, she's driving along, and suddenly she stops at an intersection. He says, well, why are you stopping? And she said, well, there's a stop sign. So each of them had unique aspects to their perspective that could help the other, but also that needed to be submissive to the other. There are things that we learn about God, but it's never the final definition. It's never the last word. And there are things that God has said in the past, through different ways, different means of communication. But it's probably not the last thing God will ever say, unless God is dead, which I don't believe. But wherever you need to come back to defining terms. What do you mean by dead? What do you mean by alive? Some people, in trying to define God, will say, well, God is dead. And I think what they might be talking about is the way that God was perceived to interact with man. If that's what God is to this person, and God is no longer doing that, then in that sense, God's dead. I choose to go a step beyond that and say, well, God's just not doing the same thing. And if doing that action was what made God alive, well, then God would be dead. But I think God's capable of a whole lot more than we've ever comprehended. And if God moves on to a new action, my understanding of God needs to move with God, not stay rooted to, for example, the historical events of the Old Testament. There are new works and new and wonderful things that God can move on to doing. And I would rather follow God into those new areas than to stay rooted in the old one and find myself without God, because God, in a sense, has left the room. The room that I have built, the room that I have chosen to occupy. There's a verse in the Bible that says, if the Lord does not build a house, in vain do the builders labor. And in doing Sisterhood, that it kind of brings me face to face with this challenge at times of trying to figure out what God is doing, rather than and harmonizing with what God is doing, instead of requiring that God bless what I have chosen to do. If I've chosen to do something, that it's just not the right time for that. It may be a perfectly good thing, it may be a perfectly good idea, but it may not be the right time or the right situation. It may not have the right collaborators to do it with me. And so I need to be willing to say, okay, well, it's a good idea, we'll remember it, but not now. If, on the other hand, I come and say, God, please bless what I'm doing here, and God's trying to tell me, now isn't the best time, probably I will go out and I will try to do it, and I will fall on my face, and it will look like one big horrendous mistake because I wasn't listening. Taking this into a more general sphere, one of my favorite authors is Madeleine L'Engle, and she often speaks of serving the work, of an artist coming to work, and if they are serving the work, they paint more than they know, they draw more than they know, they write more than they know. They are writing. In the same way, in performing a service to God, in getting in harmony with God, things happen that are beyond our comprehension, beyond what we realize is happening. Times in the past when I've done a show, and I'm just following my intuition, saying what I feel prompted to say, and 6 months later I meet someone who saw a particular episode on a particular night at a particular point in their life, and it was exactly what they needed to hear. That kind of synchronicity is not something I'm capable of orchestrating. And when I hear of that, that's when I give thanks that even in my ignorance, even in my stumbling around, I managed to serve God in some sense. I managed to be a tool in God's hand to serve someone else's need, to say what they needed to hear at a particular moment in time that hadn't even occurred yet. It's kind of amazing. And yet the more I learn about stuff like that, the less I feel the need to control things, the more I understand that there is a whole lot of things converging at any moment in time. And I'm part of it. And I get to contribute something. But I don't need to control it. It's not only up to me for something good to happen. It's a whole lot of other things that converge with my actions and my intentions and my love and my prayers to make something good happen. It's not something I can take complete credit for. The only thing I can take credit for is that I responded. That when the time came to stand up, I stood up and I said something and I did something and I did what was best and I was as honest as I could be. I'm reminded of a poem of sorts, a verse, I guess, attributed to Pastor Niemöller, who was someone who was killed in the concentration camps of World War II. That they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't speak up. And they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. And they came for the Jews, and I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't speak up. And they came for the Protestants, and I wasn't Protestant, so I didn't speak up, etc., etc. And finally they came for me. And by that time, there was no one to speak up. I think even if our answers are tentative, it's important to stand up and to speak up and to stand for something. To the degree that we are not willing to stand up, that we're not willing to be counted for believing what we do, or that we're not willing to believe in equality and love and peace, and including everyone that has anything to offer. To the extent that we don't stand up for those things, we allow potentially the worst to happen. We allow for the possibility of another Adolf Hitler, for another person with so much woundedness inside of them that they cannot help but express volumes of woundedness. And if we say nothing, they may find themselves in a position of great power, such as Adolf Hitler did, such that their expressions of woundedness go much further than they would have otherwise. I'm sure we each have our own woundedness, and yet there is always the opportunity to work through our woundedness and to allow our woundedness to be presented to God and to be transformed into something wonderful, something empowering, something we never dreamed it could be transformed into. Like the story in the New Testament of the Bible where a man was brought to Jesus who had been born blind, and they said, whose sin was it? Was it his parents? Did he do something wrong? Did they do something wrong? Who screwed up here? And Jesus said, nobody screwed up. He was born this way so that the power of God and the glory of God could be revealed. And Jesus promptly healed him. You know, if there were no one with blindness, with lameness, with infirmities, with illnesses, with diseases, with handicaps of whatever kind, disabilities, if none of that existed, Jesus wouldn't have been able to heal a single person while he was here on earth. It simply wouldn't have happened. At the same time, I have to say, but the suffering they went through, wasn't there some other way? And perhaps there wasn't. But it doesn't make it any easier for me to accept what those people had to tolerate for so many years, waiting for Jesus to come along and heal them. Life is a mixed bag, and it's also a collaborative effort. Someone willing to do the suffering, someone willing to come along and be the healer. And me as Sister Who, willing to do whatever I can in my own unique ways, in my own unique form and appearance. Sometimes I think I'm envious of Jesus, though, because I think he had a certainty and a guidance where too often I feel confused and I'm not quite sure because things aren't black and white. There's all these shades of gray, and it's real hard to know where to draw the line. I'd like to share a little bit of a song I wrote with you. This is one, it just kind of comes from that place of not knowing. And also that intention of, if I can't do anything else, what do I do in the middle of all this? Where am I in this big, confusing sort of picture? When the dark clouds sweep over and the path fades in the wood and the way is not for me to see, when I have no one to follow but may find one follows me, may your voice be heard inside my heart and my thoughts be O Lord, be seen in all my days, your most transcendent person, your mysterious ways. Oh, may I always sing your praise. No matter how you appear to me, or the future you reveal to me, of all the things I am to be, let me be your love. And there are a lot of different ways that God appears. I had an interesting time meeting with some friends who espouse more, I suppose you'd say pagan or earth-oriented religions, those sorts of perspectives. And for them, God was a woman. And that's where in the song I wanted to include the line that, no matter how you appear to me, I think what God is, whatever God is, it is only my perspective that changes. And sometimes I see God as a man, and sometimes I see God as a woman, and sometimes I see God as a burning bush. Sometimes, as with Moses, the fire by night and the cloud by day. The Old Testament is filled with all sorts of different incarnations or physical forms, or apparently physical forms that God seemed to take. But the point was not the form. The point was the message, what was communicated, what was understood. See, actually, people think in images, in meanings, in understandings. Our words, all languages, are auditory symbols of the things we have in our minds. The challenge is in coming up with those auditory symbols that will create in the other person's mind the same picture, the same understanding, the same image that is in our own mind. As Sister Who, I work with symbols a lot. I'm dressed in symbols from head to foot. And in those symbols, I find a sort of multi-dimensionality, a sense in which there is so much more to me than just what is seen. But I think that's true of everyone else too. Too often driving down the highway, I see people, and all they are to me is a person operating a car that just cut me off. Or I might see an older person in the library, and they're just an older person with a book in their hands. Given the opportunity to get beyond that, however, they become a doorway through time to all sorts of experiences. Someone who might have been there at the Civil Rights March in the 1960s in Washington. Someone who might have been there to see what it was like to have people coming home from World War II. Someone who was there at Woodstock. I met a lady who was actually at the Woodstock Festival once, and was able to tell from a first-hand account what it really felt like, as opposed to the pictures and the movies and the recordings, the image that I would get from those sorts of things. And it's not always the same. And I imagine if I asked every single person who went to the Woodstock Festival what happened, they would all have a different story. And so we go through life, and even here in Billings, maybe we don't talk to each other as much as we should, maybe we don't understand each other as much as we should. It doesn't mean the stories aren't there, it doesn't mean the different perspectives aren't there, and it doesn't mean that we can't begin to communicate and understand and open ourselves to others, to have the openness and the vulnerability, to allow people to see a little bit of who we really are. And in that seeing, in that sharing, in that collaboration, in affirming that life really is a collaborative effort, finding that we suddenly have a whole lot more to work with, a whole lot more wisdom than we did, a whole lot more courage to attempt new things, a whole lot more insight into how to attempt a new thing and have less chance of being hurt by it. A whole lot more insight into what does clothing say about a person? What does the fact that I wear a dress say? What does it mean? Does it mean anything? And if it is only about me, and the fact that I wear a dress doesn't say anything about you, then it is only an opportunity for you to learn, and not any judgment or comment on you in any way. There are so many unspoken messages, so many other things to discuss. I do hope you'll continue to join with me as we continue the show every other Tuesday evening here, and that in the dialogue, in the exchange, we will each become more and more aware of all the things we're communicating that we don't realize we're communicating. As Sister Who, I try to be more self-aware of what I'm communicating, but I'm sure there are other things people are picking up that I'm not even aware of, and I hope that at some point I'll be able to meet those people and discuss those things with them. For now, among other, if nothing else, I would ask that you understand from me that it's okay to be different, that whatever your difference is, make it beautiful, make it dance, make it sing of the beauty that you have only within you, that nobody else has to give. Thank you for joining me, and please join me again as we continue this discussion.